Most people really struggle with one key aspect of running form, and unfortunately, it's arguably the most important one. If you don't do this correctly, then all of the other cues that we might use or might hear for running form just aren't going to work very well. Welcome back to Trail and Ultra Running Training. My name is Will Frantz. I'm a running coach and a strength coach, and I've helped athletes get stronger and improve their performance in races ranging from 5Ks to 200 miles. And the whole goal of this podcast is to help you train a little better so you can improve your performance and hopefully have more fun. If you like this information, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe or follow or leave a rating or review, or even better, just share it with someone. Right, now let's get to the topic at hand. I think this is going to be a fairly short one today. It's also arguably going to be better on video, but I'm going to do my best to describe everything as best as I can. And I will include the link to the video in the show notes if you listen to this on a podcast, if there's anything you want to check out. All right, fair warning, this one includes some nerd stuff, as I have a tendency to do. Right. It also contains some very practical solutions to solve one of the bigger problems I see when it comes to running form. Now, I'm just going to get that out of the way. It is pelvic positioning. Now, if you're struggling with pain when you run, it's going to be in your low back, your hamstring, or your hip flexor, or your calves, or your feet, then this could apply to you. And that list might feel way too long to be connected, and it did to me as well. I've been seeing a couple consistent issues throughout this year, and it's been baffling to me. And it's been a pain in your hip flexor, specifically your rec fem, right? Like here, center punching down your femur. If we point on your hip bone there, comes straight down the center of your quad. And there's been pain. I've had multiple athletes experiencing some pain there or whatever, and they have seen PTs and doctors, and there's been a wide range of assessments. To some degree, a lot of them have just been tight hip flexors, which is not a particularly useful term because there's 9 hip flexors or something, but your rectus femoris is a hip flexor. It is also one of your quadricep muscles. It is the only quadricep muscle that connects across your hip. Most of them are on the upper end of your femur, your big thigh bone, and then they go down and go across your knee, and they mostly create knee extension. Right? Now, your rec fem also creates knee extension. It goes all the way down across your knee, but it also comes up and crosses your hip. It is the only one of the quad muscles that crosses your hip. Now, when we're seeing pain in the top of there in some way that might be like muscle pain or tendonitis or tendinopathy or whatever language that we want to use, all of which is kind of a guess without a doctor or an MRI, don't get your medical advice from a podcast. Go see somebody. When we had these things going on with athletes, that was happening. There was pain in the hip flexor, but there's also other stuff. For some people, it was some calf pain. For other people, it was more in the Achilles. For some, it was hamstring. And for some, it was low back. Foot would also make sense here, now that I know what's going on. But that actually didn't present as much this year across people that I've been coaching. Now, if you notice, pretty much all of that, except for the hip flexor, is posterior pain stuff. Or posterior chain stuff, rather. And that means glutes and hamstrings and back and all the stuff behind you, posterior chain. Now, people have seen PTs and doctors, and we've done strength work. When we hear the idea of tight hip flexor, which is pretty common in runners, to be fair, whatever that means, we'll call tight an inability to stretch your knee well behind you while maintaining a flat pelvic position. If you look up a couch stretch or some modified version of that on the internet, be it from me or someone else, then we can see what it really looks like to stretch your quad and stretch your rec fem. And while we've made some progress there and it has kept people running, it hasn't really solved the problem, or at least not for good, which has been annoying the hell out of me. Turns out, across the board, it has been some level or another of running form, and almost everyone has been struggling with some level of pelvic positioning problems, right? So when we look at pelvic positioning, I hate the term neutral pelvis because neutral can kind of mean, it does mean something very specific. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually have a very good visual cue because your pelvis is a weird shape, right? Like we have this idea that we can tell people that your pelvis is a bowl, and we're going to keep the top flat, and when we tilt it forward, we spill water out of the bowl. It's a really good visual. Unfortunately, your spine like curves through your pelvis. We have like this tucked tailbone. Your pelvis isn't a bowl. It's this weird winged thing. And so it does make sense. It's a decent cue, but unless you like have some relationship with your body where you can feel what that might feel like, then it's not actually going to provide maybe as much help as we think. But a neutral pelvis is technically when our pelvic diaphragm and our thoracic diaphragm, we have two of them. Your thoracic diaphragm is the one on the bottom of your lungs, and your pelvic diaphragm is often what we would call your pelvic floor. When they are properly aligned, then we have a neutral pelvis. Now, if most of us go through life due to sitting and high heels or just boots or dress shoes in some version of anterior tilt. I was talking about the bowl earlier. It means we're spilling water out the front. And when we are stuck in this anterior tilt, a couple things are happening. One, we're not bracing super well with our abdomen. Two, it is much harder to use your glutes because if we drive back with the glutes, we only end up with like 15 degrees of extension. It's not a big movement, right? However, if we have our pelvis tilted forward in order to create that extension, we might have to reach back and try to kick ourselves in the back of the head. So if we don't have this neutral pelvis, we might have to work way harder to kick back. So if I'm flat here, if I'm tilted forward, it's going to be a much bigger kick. And if that's the case, then we're not going to be able to use our glutes super well, right? First, we might end up in this like weird external rotation twist the further back we go. So it's more likely that some of these stabilizers of our butt, like our gemellus and our piriformis and all these things that like keep our pelvis laterally stable, are going to have to work harder. It's going to prevent our ability to create force because we're not going to be able to actually drive solidly through the ground. We're much more likely to hop forward using our calf because unless you just have insane ankle flexion, as we press back, if we're not really driving with our glute yet and our calf is fully engaged because we're like 30 degrees behind us, then we're going to pop forward with our calf rather than drive forward with our glute. As we extend all the way back there like a ballerina and we have to recover, we're going to use more of our rec fem because it is pulling, it's this hip flexor, right? We have to drive the knee through rather than just letting it come through because of how far we're having to reach. As such, this is one of the reasons we end up with a lot of struggle there. And then finally, we're more like overstride a bit or have to like pull our heel through with our hamstring or land a little bit and overstride and drive back with the hamstring, which means we can end up with all these other things. So if the pelvis is not in a good position, it doesn't matter how much you try to use the glutes. Because if anything, we're going to end up causing or creating more problems by trying to use them. Now, to fix the pelvis, it's the first thing, right? And again, not a huge fan of fixed, not a huge fan of neutral, but it does deliver the point. It is also so boring. Like, we love to talk about push with the tush or whatever, like things we might have heard on the internet from people I've quoted, and I think super useful. But neutral pelvis is the key to making the rest of these things happen. And if we live in this anterior tilt forward, with our like booty popped out, then we are going to end up really struggling to run well. Now, we also don't want to go completely the other direction. We don't want to go from this big anterior tilt to like this scared, terrified, shitting dog, right? Like we don't want to go all the way there. We want to be somewhere in the middle. And if you don't have a ton of experience with this, it can be tough to find. Now, first, if you can't move your pelvis like that, like if we can't do some level of like salsa dance tilt up and down with the pelvis by using our abdomen and back muscles and not like shoving it with your hands, then we need to get that first. We need to reacquaint ourselves with the ability to move that structure of our body. It's incredibly important. I don't really care where anybody lives or what their posture is or how we just like kind of exist in the world. I'm not a huge fan of the posture shaming thing. I don't think it really matters. But if we don't have access to a wide range of motions, especially ones that we need to do the activities that we like to do, that's where we end up in problems, right? So we need to have access to these multiple different ranges of motion of our pelvis. And one way to do this would be lay on the floor on your back with your feet up, knees bent, what we might call a hook lying position, and then just tilt up and down. Try to press your low back into the floor and then let it come back up. Press your low back into the floor, let it come back up. A harder version of that would be standing against a wall. We can also do this. This is what we would do in cat-cow if we can do that really well in yoga. All right, we're going to tuck the pelvis. We're also rounding and extending that thoracic spine. We also want to be able to create that from the hips as well. So once we have access to these things, then we want to make sure we can maintain them or strengthen them or whatever, right? So once we have access, then we might do some movements like a hollow hold where we lay on our back. Again, low back is pressed against the ground, and then we're going to end up like here where you're creating a C shape out of your abdomen. You're trying to connect your rib cage and your pelvis. If you point your arms up to the ceiling and bend your knees, it will be easier. If you try to go fully extended, then it is going to be a lot harder. And honestly, most of us are probably not ready for that yet. Probably want to have our hands up a little bit and create better connection rather than trying to make it more difficult than we can actually control. And then something called like a hollow body rock would be another really good way to challenge that, because it's forcing you to maintain that tucked bracing position while in movement. Now, as I said earlier, you don't want to be in this big abdominal flex position as you run, but we want to train like slightly further positions in the gym or build some strength so that when we fall back to neutral, fall back to our like happy place, then it's somewhere in the middle. If it takes all the work in the world to even get to neutral, then we're just going to pop directly back into that anterior tilt, that forward spilling water out of the front of the bowl once we get tired, once we're like halfway through a run. However, if we train in the gym both ends ranges of motion and we're absolutely really able to control that and keep it really stable, then we're going to do much better at maintaining that position and actually using our glutes and not having to use other muscles that should be more of a like accessory, right? Like we really want this big muscle of our glute to do a lot of the driving force when we run. We don't want it to be like the small muscles of our feet popping us forward just because we don't have good pelvic positioning, right? Now, it has been a long move towards this. I do really think, and have thought for a long time, that this is the primary thing when we are looking at running form. If you cannot do the pelvis stuff, then you are not going to be able to do the glute stuff. And you can spend all the time in the world trying to fix your arm swing. You can try to drive back with your glutes as much as you want. But if we're in a bad or less than ideal overall body position, it just isn't going to pay the dividends you want it to. So if we can work on aligning pelvis and rib cage, stacking them over top of each other, then we will likely have less pain, likely run faster, and you'll have to work less hard to do both of those things. Now, I will link some videos in the show notes, and just that hopefully give you some targets on how to do this, right? Let's approach this from all directions. I'm not saying don't stretch your hip flexors. Most runners probably have tight hip flexors. It would be a good thing to do. So we can do some things like a couch stretch or a modified couch stretch if it's really tight. We can focus on things like running form. I'll link a very long video where it talks about that. And then we can do some things like working on pelvic control and holding a hollow body position or doing a hollow body rock in order to build that abdominal strength that we'd be looking to build. Now, if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me a message, DM me or email me, or click the link in the show notes that says interested in coaching. I'm always accepting new people. And if you're going to be at Javelina 100 this weekend, definitely message me. I'd love to meet you. I'm going to be there crewing somebody. Going to be a lot of hurry up and wait on my end where I hang out in the desert if somebody runs way too far, as we love doing. So I hope you have a great day. Hope to hear from you if you're going to be outside of Scottsdale this weekend, and go have some fun on the trails. Thank you again for listening to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Just a reminder, nothing you hear on this podcast is medical advice, and you should always speak with a medical professional before making changes to your training or your nutrition. If you enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, please leave a rating or review. It tells the algorithm robots that people like it, and that means more people will hear it. Or even better, just share it with someone who you think would benefit. If you prefer a video version, head to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Group on Facebook, or check out the Mountain Goat Endurance Coaching YouTube channel. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great next run.